Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? Good. All right. I am really excited to be here. So I have had a lot of fun researching this talk. So tonight I'm going to talk about the past, present, and future of HTML and HTML controls. And it's just been so fun to sort of dive into this and find out why HTML controls and styling them suck. So with that, tonight I hope you learn some new things about controls and why they are the way they are. And so with that, I want to start off with a story about myself. So I'm a designer at heart. I went to school for design. And my specialty was digital design. And I had very minimal understanding of code when I was in school. So I could build a basic site in HTML and simple CSS, but those more complex styles, that was sort of outside my skill set. And I didn't understand the web platform at all. Like, I was very traditionally design focused. And so in my digital design courses at university, I'm actually of the era where we spent more time learning about Flash and how to build websites in Flash, because you could have these very deeply, richly interactive experiences. And you didn't really have limitations when it came to styling. Like, you could just throw your website into Flash, and then you'd use ActionScript to animate things. And so I knew Flash more than I knew HTML and CSS. And then when I graduated in 2010, Flash ended up dying about a year after that. And so I had this skill set that really wasn't needed. And so when I got hired into an agency, this is where I really started to deep dive with HTML and CSS and start to learn about the web more. At this agency, I was responsible for the whole process of building a website. So I would go do the research, I'd do the wireframes, I'd do the mock-ups, which would be pixel perfect, and then I would have to go put that into code. And so I was responsible for building that. And I spent many, many, many late nights, because it was an agency, so you were on intense deadlines, and I was trying to get everything to look pixel perfect, like that mock-up that I had shown to a client who had signed off on that. And so there were many nights of unsuccessfully trying to hack my CSS to get my form controls that fit in with my design to look like what I had shown the client. And frequently, it felt like this. I'd shown some perfect mock-up, and then when I showed the client, like, my code wasn't quite rendering the way it should. And then this was in like 2012, so they would ask, like, why does this look different in Internet Explorer and Chrome and Firefox? Like, we all know that question. Well, I didn't understand the web platform, so I didn't know that there were browser inconsistencies. Like, that was a reasonable thing to tell my client. I would tell them, well, things just look differently across browsers, and they didn't find that acceptable. So I feel like I understand the pain points around designing for HTML, or designing HTML controls and trying to style them. I relate deeply to that and what I'm going to talk about tonight. So tonight, I hope I can help demystify some of those pain points around styling controls, as well as talk about what's to come with HTML and helping to relieve some of that pain. So, hi, I'm Stephanie. I am a program manager for Microsoft Edge Developer Experiences. I'm fond of calling that my fancy title because I'm a designer and a front-end developer and a developer and designer advocate for the browser. And so tonight we're going to talk about three separate things. We're going to dig into the past and find out why HTML controls are the way they are, the present, where we're at now, and then what's to come with HTML controls, and HTML in general, because there's some exciting stuff in the works. So before we get into that, we have to go back and look at some history to understand the problems with controls today. So we need to go back all the way to 1995, 25 years ago. Now, 1995 was a good year. Like, it brought us a lot of good things. It brought us things like Braveheart. Xena Warrior Princess, my favorite, the Macarena, Frappuccinos, Windows 95, and the most important player in this story tonight, the HTML 2.0 specification. So this specification is interesting because it's HTML 2.0. There was no HTML 1.0 official spec or standard. And so HTML 2.0 was the first spec that was ratified by the W3C. So there was an HTML 1.0 draft, but that had ended up expiring in early 1994. And to be honest, it was a very basic draft. The HTML elements that were being proposed in that draft were just very basic. There wasn't a lot of meat there. And so when that expired in June 1994, the HTML 2.0 draft, its purpose was to actually capture all the common HTML web practices that were out in browsers at that time and kind of say, okay, this is what the standard's going to be, and we're going to build off that. And you might be thinking that doesn't sound too bad. There can't have been that many browsers in 1994. There were actually quite a few. So from like around 1991, there was a library of code that provided the building blocks for web browsers. So all these browsers just decided to pop up. And because HTML was just so basic at the time, they ended up, all these different browsers just started building their own HTML features to fill out feature gaps because there wasn't that functionality. And so the rift in HTML continued to grow because there was no standard there. And so HTML 2.0 comes along, and we get a standard that's ratified by the W3C. And with that spec comes the standardization and introduction of form controls. So we got about six basic form controls. And what's interesting about the form controls is the spec standardized the form functionality and the method for users to enter data into an HTML document and for that data to be used to perform an action, such as logging into a website. Now, this is important. This is key because it standardized the method only. It didn't actually standardize the form parts or how they were constructed. And so it's 1995. We have our first standardized spec. We have some building blocks for websites, but we're still missing something. We don't have a standard for any styling language. We don't have CSS. We don't have anything. So CSS actually wasn't supported by browsers until 1997 with HTML 3.20, but it wasn't actually really fully embraced by all browsers until 1999 with the 4.01 specification. And so if we go back to 1995, we have form controls, and we have this piece of UI that needs to be styled, but no way to style that. So what ended up happening was the browser ended up relying on the operating system to render and style those controls, which led to a dependency on the operating system from a technical and stylistic standpoint. So even with early versions of CSS, there were parts of the form controls that CSS just couldn't access because of how they were intertwined with the operating system. And browser vendors back around 2000 and 1999 were actually extremely reluctant to give developers access to styling these controls because they were a reflection of the operating system and the visual appearance. Like the idea that developers would want to change these to look like something that wasn't the operating system that they were on wasn't a concept. And so when that kind of did arise, we were given the appearance property. But this only controlled the system level styling. Doesn't really help us solve styling the actual controls. It just lets us either remove the styling or make it look like another operating system. But even with this, there were a bunch of caveats between browsers. So there were so many different vendor prefixes and different values that some browsers supported and others didn't. And so, and then IE, of course, being IE, didn't support it at all. So it was just not a great solution and didn't really solve anything. So to recap really quickly, pre-1995, lots of browsers pop up. 1994, HTML 1.0 draft expires. 95, we get a standardized spec, and that brings form controls, but there's no standard for styling, leading to an operating system dependency. And then in 1999, browsers actually embrace CSS, and we have a standard for styling. So between 1999 and the present, form controls and functionality continue to be enhanced. We even add some new controls, and CSS continues to evolve. And so we get to this spot now where are we now? It's been 25 years. Things have progressed. You would think that things would have improved when it comes to styling HTML controls, and we've improved some things since then. It's definitely better than it was in 1999, but it's really still not that great. We could improve quite a bit. So MDN Docs has some great documentation around form controls and their stylability. And just to give like a quick overview of where we're at, I've bucketed them out into 3 different categories that kind of address how easy these form controls are to style. And so this first set, these can be styled with few problems. So we have form, field set, label, output, input, buttons. Go wild. Probably not going to run into any issues with these. The second group, checkboxes, radios, and legend, you can style them, but it might take a little bit of hacky CSS or some more complex CSS. And then this third bucket, I just lovingly refer to as the good night and good luck bucket. These will make you want to rage flip your desk, maybe throw your keyboard. These are all advanced, they're considered advanced native controls. So these either can't be styled with CSS or they're extremely limited in terms of stylability. So under the hood, these controls are extremely complex in the way that they rely on underlying architecture, either of the web platform or the operating system. And I'm not a web platform engineer, so I can't really go into that, but they're just extremely complex, and we can't give developers access to the parts that they need to style these. And so of those original forms that we got in HTML 2.0, we didn't really improve the stylability of anything. Like, it's pretty even across the board. We've got 2 that are really easy to style, 2 that are you can kind of hack, and 2 that aren't. Like, you can't do anything with that. And then we went on to add new form controls like opt group and data list, but these rely on option, which is notoriously difficult to style. So we just added some new form controls, but they have a dependency on an incredibly complex form control. So it's just impossible to work with. So we have all that goodness, just dealing with poor CSS access to a lot of the forms we use. And then we have browser inconsistencies when it comes to rendering them. So I'm a designer, and these are all different companies. Like, I get that these would look differently. They have different visual languages. But when we're building for the web, things should at least render somewhat similarly across browsers. No one should be surprised that one form control looks differently in one browser than another browser. And so, like I mentioned previously, it was only the method for entering data that was standardized, not the actual form parts. And so, on top of browser inconsistencies, we also have no extensibility. So you can't actually extend the functionality of your controls. This tweet from Scott Gell was aptly timed earlier this month. It says, well, you have one problem. You want icons in your select menu options. You decide to make a custom select menu. You now have at least 75 problems. And so when you rebuild a control from scratch, instead of using the native control, you don't get all the good stuff that's baked in with that native control. You don't get accessibility or security, but and then you have to add all that back in, and then you have to test it to make sure that you've done it correctly. And it's just not an ideal experience, but it's necessary when you can't extend your controls the way you need to. A great example of this is the video element. A developer either gets all of these controls down here with the controls attribute, or none. And when I say none, I mean I had to add a black background to see where my video element was when I removed the controls attribute. And so when we want our controls to look something like this, and even this, it's no wonder we've all just reverted to rebuilding our controls from scratch. We just can't use those native controls like we need to. So on the browser side, we decided to take a step back and ask some questions. We knew this was a pain point, but we wanted to ensure this was an area that developers really wanted us to fix. And so we asked, do they really want better form controls? And y'all do. Turns out you don't want to keep rebuilding these same components and controls over and over and over. So my colleague, Greg Whitworth, who's a PM on the Edge team, sent out an initial survey on Twitter and got about 1,400 respondents. And this was all around form controls. So he wanted to really start to dive deep into this problem space. So of those 1,400 respondents, they were all in varying roles, from full stack developers to designers, with varying degrees of experience across web development. And one of the questions Greg initially asked was if they had used a library or a framework or built their controls from scratch. And if they did, which controls did they recreate? And these were the top 10. Select and checkbox were nearly tied. And then it was followed by date, radio, file, progress, button, dialog, text area, and text. And then he asked, why are you rebuilding these controls? Why are you building them from scratch? And over a third said it was because they couldn't change the appearance sufficiently. About another third wanted to add functionality. And just under a third said because of browser inconsistencies, which one could assume has to do with appearance because they render differently across browsers. So if you lump that in with the other group that says they couldn't change appearance sufficiently, that's more than 2/3 of developers rebuilding controls just because they can't change the appearance. Like, that is a lot of dev time. And so Greg followed up with an amended survey at JSConf EU last May, and he added 2 new questions, and he asked which form control gives you the most frustration and why. And select clearly stole the show, with nearly half of respondents saying select was their biggest pain point. The next closest one was date, with just under a fifth of respondents. And so then he asked why, and these were some of the verbatims that we got from respondents. Select requires hacky tricks, can't style option elements at all to the extent we need to, too little control over styling across popular browsers, but the amount of work it takes to implement an accessible alternative with complete feature parity is massive. And I can feel the pain in this response. Like, I'm a very empathetic person, probably because I'm a designer, but I can just feel the pain in this. And so I wanted to do my own research to find out how painful is this for developers. And so I ended up asking design and developer Twitter to please fill in the blank. I would rather blank than attempt to style a native select element. And it turns out, y'all really hate select. I got over 270 responses to this tweet, which is probably the most I've ever received on Twitter. And these were some of my favorite responses. So I would rather call each person attempting to use the form and ask them what option they would like, convince my fellow programmers to reinstall Silverlight, build the entire site in Flash, support IE6. I'd rather use Vim. Breakdance barefoot on a pile of Legos. Grind my teeth to the jawbone with rough sandpaper. Chew on glass which actually came up a couple times, boil my toes in lava, and perhaps my favorite, maybe a little bit melodramatic, but heat up a rusty old fork with a few tines snapped off and broken, then with both arms thrust it into my inner thigh, then attempt to style a native select element. Clearly, this is a massive pain point for developers. So what are we going to do about it? Because we can't continue on this path. So let's talk about the future, not just for Select, but HTML in general. And I'm excited to say there is some cool stuff in the works. So HTML in general, it isn't done. It is a living language. And so on the Edge team, we've actually been working really closely with the Chrome team to update the controls in the Chromium project. So we've been focused on 2 areas for existing controls. So we're focused on updating the styles and then accessibility improvements. So we're bringing a lot of the good stuff that was in the Edge HTML browser engine over to Chromium. And then with the visual refresh, getting rid of those gradients and shadows, not so Web 2.0 anymore, and making the controls that are in Chromium a bit more universal and neutral, with the hope that in the meantime, while we work on trying to figure out how to fix styling controls, that maybe you can use these instead of having to rebuild your own. And there's also some new native components in the works with HTML. So the community has, again, been key in signaling what new native components they want. In Greg's survey, he asked what people wanted, and virtual lists and scrollers and toggle switches were nearly tied for the top requested native components in HTML. And so I'm happy and excited to say that the Chrome team is actually working on both of these. So if you go to either of the links shown here, that will actually take you to the platform status page for these, and that will link you out to a GitHub and some prototypes where you can play around with these things. And so both of these are proposals right now. And so what that means is these will incubate in the Web Incubator community group, the WICG. And then after incubation, multi-implementer interest is required before graduating to an HTML standard. So if you want these things to be native HTML standardized components, go tell Mozilla and WebKit that you want these things. Voice your opinion, because we need one of them to get on board with this so that these can move into being an actual HTML standard. And now let's talk about fixing the current problems with controls and styling them specifically. So like I've mentioned a couple times, it's the controls and their parts that aren't standardized. And so because these aren't standardized, they're not the same across browsers, so we can't give developers access to those parts to style them. And so on the browser side, this begs the question, how do you even start to standardize a control? Because there are actually a lot of opinions on this. And so I would like to introduce you to OpenUI. This is not another framework. This is actually an initiative under the WICG to standardize form controls and components and their parts. So OpenUI's mission is to maintain an open standard for UI and promote its adherence and adoption. And a couple of the goals with it are to document component names as they exist today, define a common language for describing UIs and design systems, eventual browser standards for web app components, and converge designer processes and developer workflows. And the thing about this is standardizing controls and components is hard. We're browser builders. We're not design system maintainers. And so we want to ensure that we're approaching this the right way and doing this right the first time. So we've been meeting with lots of first and third-party partners who maintain frameworks and design systems. And Greg's been really diving deep into the survey questions that he had initially sent out to the community and finding out what these design systems and frameworks would use and what do they need from their controls. And so OpenUI is great because it's bringing together the people who are doing this work every day, and web platform engineers with the intent of documenting the different control and component patterns across design systems, finding similarities in those patterns, and then starting to set forth proposals for those standardized parts and naming with the intent of this actually making its way into the browser. And so the first control that we're looking at is, of course, select. We heard your pain. And so on the browser side, we're starting to dig into select and figure out why it is so hard to style. And I can tell you one reason is because select elements actually escape the browser UI, and that actually introduces a security risk. So we can't keep this feature and offer complete styling control to developers. So on the browser side, we need to understand how important this capability is to end users and compare that with the limitations it causes developers, which does ultimately end up impacting end users. So there's a lot of research that we need to do and a lot of data that still needs to be gathered, but it is being worked on. And so in the OpenUI repo, this is all open. You can go to the working draft for select and check out the proposal for the different parts of select and standardizing it. And so if you're interested in that, you can go to aka.ms/select-OU, and that will take you to the working draft. And then if you're interested in OpenUI all up, this is a link for that. And again, we really, really want to ensure that we're building the right thing. So we want the community to get involved. So you can go to aka.ms/open-UI, and that'll take you to the OpenUI website. And there's a link to the GitHub, which you can go open issues and contribute to the different conversations that are happening around the different controls. And there's actually a couple different things you can do too. So if you work on a design system or maintain a framework, you can actually go on to OpenUI and add your design system. We're trying to get as many design systems and frameworks documented as we can so that we can really make a recommendation for those patterns for component naming and controls. And then secondly, just provide feedback. This work is under the WICG for a reason, and we want to ensure we're doing this correctly. So please go give your feedback on what you want for your components and controls. We need you. And so just to recap a couple different things that you can do, you can provide feedback on the current HTML control prototypes that Chrome has. Contribute to the form control investigations on OpenUI, and tell browser vendors what you need from your form controls. And go ahead and follow these folks. So these are the people working on the controls work. So Stubbornella is the Google Chrome PM, Nicole Sullivan. Greg Whitworth is the Microsoft Edge PM leading this, and I'm Ciata. I help Greg, and you can always ping me, and I will be sure your feedback gets to Greg. Because we're here to listen. So we want to make these improvements for you and ensure we're doing it correctly. And with that, I want to segue into next month's meetup because this ties into feedback. So I run an initiative with my coworker, Aaron Gustafson, in collaboration with Mozilla, Chrome, Samsung Internet, and Agalia called The Web We Want. And this is a live session that is focused on getting feedback from developers. So there's two components to this session. One, we have a website, so I'll have it up here in a minute. But if you go to webwewant.fyi, we're asking developers or web designers the question, if you could wave a magic wand and change something about the web platform, what would it be? I mean, it could be an API, it could be a tool you don't have, it could be something that you have to hack around constantly that you feel like there should be a native solution for. And so we're asking you to go answer that question and fill out the form on webwewant.fyi. There's about, I think, 200 responses in there already. We've been running this for about 7 or 8 months. And all the different browser vendors and standards folks actually can go in and see this, and they're looking at this feedback. And so we'll be running this session next month here at SFHTML. So what that means is, depending on how many submissions we get for next month's event, we'll have 4 to 6 submissions, and those are presented as a 3 to 5 minute lightning talk. And then in between each of those lightning talks, we have a panel of judges who are industry experts who just provide feedback on the problem or feature that you're proposing. And then 2 winners at the end will be selected by the judging panel, and then the meetup audience. People pick what they think browser vendors should go work on. And those top 2 things get taken back to all the folks who are involved in this initiative, and we start conducting research and start getting those things actually put into browsers. So we're really, really focused on putting the community first here and hearing from developers about what it is that makes doing your job painful. Because we can come up with shiny new features that maybe don't solve one of your problems, and that doesn't add a lot of value to you. So this is a great way to ensure that browser vendors are hearing what you want and what you need for building for the web. So again, webwewant.fyi is the website. webwewantfyi is the Twitter handle. Again, I'm Ciata, and then Aaron Gustafsson is my partner in crime with running this. And with that, thank you.